in the cabins, even if it is contemporary history and recent history. And he said, oh, I don't really remember how old I was, DJ, but I was that tall. So, I've been here a long time, no doubt about it. He's got to be in his 60s, almost 70 now. He retired, kind of, so. But Mr. Leroy lived in this cabin right here. So for us, it was about recognizing that, my gosh, this isn't just a story of slavery times, although, of course, that's going to be, you know, a good portion of what we discussed today. But it's also a reminder to us that, yeah, African-American families, some families still continued to live in former slave cabins, because that's what these are, you know, right through the modern civil rights era. I mean, can you imagine? And that was a humbling kind of little revelation. So what we've done here is we've intentionally restored the cabins to different time periods to represent the fact that the cabins were lived in as long as they were. Now, all the cabins, with the exception of this one, would have looked identical, okay? The 4 cabins here would have all had the same dimensions. They would have all been built on a floor plan that was a duplex. They were, again, very commonplace throughout the South. This kind of architecture of a duplex would have been very commonplace. So these cabins, again, aren't unique in the grand scheme of things, but here at Magnolia, you know, these cabins would have been homes to 2 families and hence 2 front doors. Oh. Anywhere, now there are scholars that have made their life's work out of looking at these kind of cabins, what remains and what historical accounts, and they've come up with information like, well, on average, these cabins would contain as many as 6 to 12 people per side.
Per side?
Per side, yeah. So they were duplexes. Now this cabin right here, is
smaller,
unique because it is smaller, and you can see we only got 1 door. You know, these have 2 doors. This cabin, when we took it apart, we started looking at these are original exterior wallboard. Can you see the remnant of the newspaper there? We started taking this cabin apart, and based on fragmentary evidence like the newspapers, and based on the construction methods and how they differ from the other 4 cabins, we think this cabin was built in 1900. So again, it speaks to the fact that there were still African-American families living in this area right in here. So for us, it was about coming to grips with, okay, well, what were they doing here after emancipation and through the modern civil rights era? Okay. And then, you know, how did all this start? I mean, how old is this plantation? And, you know, what was going on here even long before these cabins were constructed? So let's go back for a little bit, and then we'll come back and we'll kind of, you know, revisit this idea that the cabins were lived in through the 20th century. But these plantations in the Charleston area all began, for the most part, with this. You know, there were settlers that arrived here in the 1670s, and they were looking right from day one to establish a plantation economy in this area. And they were, you know, they didn't know what to expect. You know, they hadn't lived here before. They were newcomers. So before they got here, they were thinking, okay, we want to establish plantations in that far-off place we're going to call the Carolina Colony. What do we grow there? We better, you know, we better be ahead of the game. So we're going to plan on growing sugarcane. We're going to plan on growing tobacco. Why? Because, well, a lot of the first families, including the Draytons that owned this property here, they left England, went to the Barbados, and then came here. And in the Barbados, what were they growing and how did they establish plantations in that area? But centered around sugarcane, exactly. So they thought, okay, well, we'll just duplicate. You know, we'll just kind of, you know, we'll start sugar planting there in the Carolina Low Country. Of course, what they find out is that sugarcane didn't grow that well here. So they knew that their cousins up the coast a ways, up there in the mid-Atlantic states in Virginia and Maryland and, you know, and later North Carolina. But what were they growing? But, of course, tobacco. So they tried planting that here, and they find out tobacco doesn't grow very well here in the Low Country. So they were thinking, again, before they arrived here, they were thinking things like grapes and olives and even mulberry bushes, because they were thinking they could culture silk here, because, you know, silkworms attach themselves to mulberry bushes. Anyway, all these things proved to be kind of a false start. So what grows well in a naturally swampy area along the coast, along all these inland rivers, but
rice.
A cereal crop that grows well in a flooded field. You have certain types of rice grow very well in the swamps, and that's what this stuff is. So we end up introducing rice culture pretty early in terms of, you know, our colonial history. If they settle here in the 1670s, they're probably planting rice within, you know, 10 years. And from there, 100 years later, all of these plantations collectively, of course, beginning in the Charleston area, but branching out, dozens of rice plantations as far north as Wilmington and as far south as Jacksonville are going to cultivate this Carolina gold rice. That's the name given this rice. This rice that would be grown throughout this region. And again, by the time of the Revolution, we're producing 1/3 to 1/2 of the world's exported rice. Thus becoming the #1 rice exporters in the world at that time. Exporting Carolina gold, which had a reputation around the time of the Rev War as being the best quality rice anywhere. You know, the Paris Rice Exchange, our rice was trading at the highest price. So people around the world acknowledged Carolina rice as being number one. Of course, Charleston ultimately became the wealthiest city in colonial America. So, you know, albeit we love our Boston history, you know, we love our Philadelphia history, we love that all that colonial history from places like New York and Boston and Philly, but by a wide margin, the wealthiest city in colonial America was Charleston. And this right here explains where that wealth came from. Now, of course, indigo also plays a role, and you guys might learn a little bit about that while you're here in the Low Country, and that's a little plant that was used to make a dye for dyeing things blue, right? Indigo blue. But this was the main revenue generator. And in fact, if you were going to look at the time of the Revolution, who were the 10 wealthiest colonists at that time, 9 of the 10 on that list are going to be rice planters. Okay, and there's another guy, well, the one guy from New England that's on that list happens to be involved in the slave trade. So anyway, there we are. But nonetheless, this is the stuff that made incredible fortunes. So coming here to Magnolia and looking at a 500-acre plantation, 12, 13, whatever, a dozen or more miles from downtown Charleston, today this is prime real estate. But consider this for a second. This plantation, the Drayton's first plantation, is probably one of 29 plantations this family owned at one time. And that's all of the male heads of generations, okay? You know, everything was based on, you know, the eldest adult male. Although don't be mistaken into believing that the adult, you know, the firstborn son got everything and the rest of the children got nothing. That's not true. You look at the probate records and actually they divvied things up quite generously. Usually the adult males were getting twice the share, but the others were getting stuff too. But, you know, it's amazing. So if you count all the women that married into the Drayton family, we're probably looking at 50 to 60 plantations because those ladies were bringing in property and bringing in plantation holdings. So to say that the Draytons are emblematic of this very wealthy group of people that were involved in rice culture, you know, they're not the wealthiest by any means. So, but I want you to know that you know, the important thing here is that rice ends up propelling these families into the ranks of the most wealthy people in the world at that time. But here's the curiosity about rice culture here in the Low Country, and that is, you know, first of all, where does the rice come from? You know, is this a native plant? Of course, we find out it's not. We find out that this rice is originally, the plant itself comes from Africa. So that's kind of a hint as to where we then start to look for then some kind of connections to how this then plays into our understanding of these cabins, the folks that lived in the cabins, and of course the greater sort of, you know, world of African American history. And then you got to wonder, okay, well, how much did folks from England, coming perhaps even by way of the Barbados, know about growing rice? You know, how much rice they grow back in England? Well, they didn't grow any rice. So it is kind of, think about it, it is really interesting. You got these folks that come from England, and within a couple of decades, you know, they're really producing a lot of rice, and by 100 years later, they're some of the wealthiest people in the world based on an agriculture that was completely